Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Aaron Wallach, and today this will be a first of a series of videos I'll be making on a book by Anthony Weston called A Rule Book for Arguments, the 5th edition. Again, that's Anthony Weston. He's a philosophy professor at, where's the university? He's professor of philosophy and environmental studies at Elon University, and he gives a really good manual, just laying out several rules on good arguments and as well as some logical fallacies to avoid. And today's video will mostly be concerning what argumentation is and why it's important, as well as I'll also be touching on the first rule of argumentation. So yeah, let's just get right into it. So he opens his introduction by asking us, what's the point of arguing? So just keep that question in mind as we kind of go through the introduction. Many people think that arguing is simply stating their prejudices in a new form. This is why many people also think that arguments are unpleasant and pointless. One dictionary definition for argument is disputation. In this sense, we sometimes say that two people have an argument, that is to say, a verbal fistfight. It happens often enough, but it is not what arguments really are. In this book, to give an argument means to offer a set of reasons or evidence in support of a conclusion. Here, an argument is not simply a statement of certain views, and it is not simply a dispute. Arguments are efforts to support certain views with reasons. Arguments are efforts to support certain views with reasons. Arguments in this sense are not pointless. In fact, they are essential. Argument is essential in the first place because it is a way of finding out which views are better than others. Not all views are equal. Some conclusions can be supported by good reasons. Others have much weaker support. But often we don't know which are which. We need to give arguments for different conclusions and then assess those arguments to see how strong they really are. Argument is essential for another reason too. Once we have arrived at a conclusion that is well supported by reasons, we use arguments to explain and defend it. A good argument doesn't merely repeat conclusions. Instead, it offers reasons and evidence so that other people can make up their minds for themselves. If you become convinced that we should indeed change the way we raise and use animals, for example, you must use arguments to explain how you arrived at your conclusion. That is how you will convince others, by offering the reasons and evidence that convinced you. It is not a mistake to have strong views. The mistake is to have nothing else. Okay, so breaking down that section a little bit, we have what Weston gives as a definition for argument. So what he means by argument is to offer a set of reasons or evidence in support of a conclusion. He says, an argument is not simply a statement of like your opinion or just like a view itself, but it offers support for views with reasons. He also says that argument is essential because it sort of gives you a way to figure out which views are stronger than others. So based on, the rigor or the efficacy of its logic, of its reasoning, you could decide which views are better than others, right? He says some conclusions, and by conclusion he means basically just like a statement or like an argument claim. He says some conclusions can be supported by good reasons, others have much weaker support, right? And then he says argument's essential for another reason too, right? So even if you have a view that's well supported by reasons, you need to show that argument to explain and defend it, right? So it's not enough to just have the view, you have to actually support it by stating those reasons yourself. And the reasons that convinced you, right? You should never give an argument that you're not like convinced about yourself just because you think, others might be convinced of it and they might think you're smart or whatever, So yeah. So the next section he titles Argument Grows on You. So I'll just read some of that as well. Typically, we learn to argue by assertion. That is, we tend to start with our conclusions, so our desires or opinions, without a whole lot to back them up. And it works sometimes, at least when we're very young. What could be better? Real argument, by contrast, takes time and practice. Marshalling our reasons, proportioning our conclusions to the actual evidence, considering objections and all the rest, these are acquired skills. We have to grow up a little. We have to put aside our desires and our opinions for a while and actually think. Moreover, the practice of argument turns out to have some attractions. Our minds become more flexible, open-ended, and alert. We come to appreciate how much difference our own critical thinking can really make. From everyday life to politics, science, philosophy, and even religion, arguments are constantly offered to us for our consideration, and we may in turn offer back our own. Think of argument as a way to make your own place within these unfolding, ongoing dialogues. What can be better than that? Okay, so in this section, he basically talks about how, like, in the beginning of our lives, as kids or whatever, we learn to argue by just asserting things. It's like, oh, I want this, I want that. It's like, oh, I think this, I think that. But you don't really offer anything to support what you're saying. Right? He says, and he says that this works sometimes, when we are that young kid, right? But he says real argument by contrast takes time and practice. Marshaling our reasons, proportioning our conclusions to the actual available evidence, considering objections. These are skills that aren't natural to us. We have to learn to acquire them by practice. He also said we have to grow up, essentially. We can't just expect people to think what we think all the time without, at least trying to convince them of that what we think is true, or it's at least noteworthy. So yeah. And then he also says how, in the end here, our minds become more open-ended. We kind of open ourselves up to the views of others also when we learn how to argue. When we learn how to argue, we're also able to contribute something to, like, certain fields like philosophy, religion, politics, and we can actually contribute arguments of our own and maybe even advance the field. So yeah. Okay, so based on all of that, I will now give what is Weston's first general rule for arguments. So before he gets into this rule, he kind of gives us a little overview of what the first chapter is going to be about. And he says, arguments begin by marshaling reasons and organizing them in a clear and fair way. Chapter 1 offers general rules for composing short arguments. And then all the other chapters, they basically discuss the specific kinds of arguments. But his first rule for argumentation is just a very general rule for, like, that's pretty much applicable to any kind of argument you're making. So the first rule is resolve premises and conclusion. Okay, so what does that mean? We'll get into that. Okay, so he says the very first step in making an argument is to ask yourself what you are trying to prove. What is your conclusion? Remember that the conclusion is the statement for which you are giving reasons. The statements that give your reasons are your premises. Okay, so we got two terms here, conclusion and premises. And whenever he says conclusion, remember he says it's the statement for which you are giving reasons. So I mean, if you're a student, this might be like the main claim or like the thesis of your paper, or like if you're writing a paper, or just giving any kind of general argument. So yeah, it's like your main claim, your argument statement, like your thesis, something like that. And the premises, those are the statements that give the reasons in support of your conclusion, right? So it's just like, oh, I believe that, drinking and driving is wrong. Well, what are the reasons for you thinking that? And those reasons are your premises, right? Okay. And Weston, he offers kind of a funny example, but it's also very clear, and I really like it. He says, say we have the conclusion that, people should eat more beans, right? And he says that is your belief, right? That's something that you believe as a person. We just think everyone should eat more beans. But why? What are your reasons? And then from that, he gives us one main premise, which is that beans are healthy, right? So now we have two things. We have the conclusion, right? We should eat more beans. And now we have a premise, why we should eat more beans. And that reason is that, beans are healthy. So, I mean, this is a fairly straightforward and simple argument, but it kind of just puts in perspective those two key terms. And this can serve as just kind of like the basic mechanics of any argument. Okay, so then he goes on, he gives another premise for this argument, but I'm not going to go into that right now. Okay, so now he talks about the second part of that rule. He says, in Rule 1, resolve premises and conclusion, the word resolve has two related meanings. Okay, so here he's dealing with that word resolve. Okay, what does he mean by like resolve premises and conclusion? So he says, one meaning of the word resolve is to distinguish, right? So if we think of resolve as distinguish, right, we can think of the rule as saying, oh, we need to distinguish our premises from our conclusion, right? He says that your reasons are different from your conclusion. Keep them clearly separate. Go back to the premise of the bean argument, right? He says beans are healthy. That's not the conclusion. That's the premise, right? That's the statement of your reason in support of a conclusion, right? And then the conclusion was we should eat more beans, right? The statement for which you are giving reasons. Okay, so he says, once you have distinguished your premises and conclusion, be sure that both of them are claims that you want to commit to. This is the other meaning of resolve. So he says, the other meaning of resolve is to commit to something, right? If you're not committed to your argument, don't make it, right? That's essentially what he's saying. So if you were, committing to an argument, that's another meaning of resolve premises and conclusions. Okay, so I just went over the introduction as well as the very first rule of his book, a rule book for arguments, which is resolve premises and conclusion. And that is sort of just like the very basic part of his book. It gets a lot more complicated, and I'll be covering more of that content in later videos. So if you like this video, be sure to like it. Also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you later.